How's it going, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to look at the tools that I find essential for everyday use when guitar building and just general buggering about and maintaining. One of the handiest tools I've got is this Music Nomad Octopus, which a friend of mine bought me, and it actually gets used pretty much every single build. One of the most important things about this is it's made of nylon, so it won't scratch chrome work, it won't damage the hardware at all, and for the most part it's fairly easy going on the finishes. As you can see, one of the sockets that I use the most is the 10mm, which is usually used for machine heads and keeping them tight. I'm pretty close to rounding this out because sometimes they're installed too tight, and it's not just these 5 that you've got on this end, you've also got an extra socket on this end. Now there are 2 1/2-inch sockets. I would say that this one is a slightly more robust plastic, but I tend not to use 1/2-inch anyway because I don't really have many American imports. The screwdriver section of it is double-ended, so you've got a pretty good Phillips head, a fairly robust flat head. I've not managed to twist this up by altering bridge heights yet, so that's doing quite well. However, I have chewed up the Phillips head a little bit. It's probably worth me buying a new one soon. In a similar vein, we've got the Cruise Tools T-bar, which is a 1/2-inch, 12mm and 7/16. So not as many options as you'll find with this. And I tend to find that it's not quite as good for all purposes. Probably great if you're messing around with Gibsons and anything built in the US, but most of my guitars use metrics. It is, however, really solid. Next up, I would always recommend really good quality screwdrivers. You don't want something that's going to chew up when you're screwing, and you also want something that's going to fit your screws really, really well. I tend to use a larger one for anything that's holding down a metal plate, so bridges, neck plates, things like that. This is a PZ2, tends to be a good size for all. Then you've got the PZ1, which is great for scratch plates and bridge intonations, and will also do the screws on the back of your machine heads. Next up is a miniature drill. I use this a lot more than you'd think. It's really good because it means you've got a bit more control instead of using a power tool, and it's quite precise and really, really good for doing pilot holes. Speaking of pilot holes, I'll always use this for making a start on the holes. It's quite good because you can actually ream out with it, as well as just puncturing the finish and making sure that there's no splitting. And while we're on the subject of reaming, this is extremely useful. This one's a little bit beaten up and chewed now because I've been using it for years, and I've used it on metal and wood and plastic and all sorts, so it's feeling a little bit sorry for itself. Now, when it comes to screwdrivers, a precision multi-driver is a really good thing to have. This one's about 10 years old now, so I've had it a really long time, and most of the bits are still good. These are really good in a pinch because it means that you can do your plastic plates and you can actually set the intonation because you've got your hex keys. The only downside of this is it's not ratcheted. I could always find a ratcheted one, I just haven't been bothered yet. Little brush is great for cleaning. One of the things that I really hate is the amount of dust and that sort of general white anthrax powder that you get in cheaper guitars. So when you're taking the pickups out, you can always just give this a little brush and it'll get rid of everything like that. Really good for dusting off around the machine heads as well. Little snips, make sure they're really good ones because when you're cutting through strings, you don't want the blade to get dulled. And I did actually used to have a cheaper pair of these, which sheared off while I was trying to cut a low E string. So you want to be careful with that, make sure you get something that's made of a decent quality metal. I particularly like the springy types. While we're on it, I would say that a really good wire stripper is essential. You want something that's going to cut and strip and also pinch sometimes. These ones have terminal pinches, but you don't really tend to use them for guitars, so that doesn't really matter. But the actual sharpness of the wire stripper itself is a really useful thing to look out for. Fret rubbers, not really something you'd normally think of. These are made by a company called Calico, and they're essentially rubber with a fine grit texture built into them. So really good for polishing frets and also great for just sort of getting your edges nice and smooth. So you can start with a coarse, work your way through medium, and then eventually work to the fine. While we're on the subject of frets, I would say that a fret crowning file is a really good thing to have. This one's quite ergonomic. This actually has a very hard diamond coating so that you can just run it across the frets and it will take off all the roughness and scratches of general wear and tear. I also use it for a little bit of taking off the sharp tangs, but usually for that I use one of these things, again from Calico, and you've got a 45° and a 90° angle, and you literally just run it across the edges of your frets and it will add a little bevel to it. Nice and easy and great for doing your rough bevels before you actually do your polishing. Next up is this snail-shaped thing. I use this for leveling my frets. This does actually have quite a smooth diamond coating on it, so it's quite fine, but it does also come with different grades of sandpaper, which you can use to either make it coarser or finer depending on what you're doing. I would get these out of the bag, but they're covered in black dust from years of polishing frets, so I don't really want that all over my hands at the moment. Something that people don't often think about with guitar toolboxes is tuners. Obviously these are essential for checking intonations, checking that you've got everything working fine, and also for general setups. So I've got two kinds here. I've got your standard little cheapy clip-on one. It's all you need, it does the job. And I've also got a little cheap one. I think this was about £2 or something off eBay. Again, chromatic tuner, and it just means that you're not relying on the resonance of the headstock. It means that you're checking that the signal's coming through nice and clean from the output jack. I would always recommend having a bundle of heat shrink lying around. I tend to go for a slightly thinner grade just because I know it will get around solder joints and also generally insulate against shorting. Screws. Always have an abundance of screws. These are about a tenner off Amazon and they'll last you for ages. This is a string action ruler. Does what it says it does. So you've got different measurements. You've got your millimeters, you've got your inches. It also tells you what your string height should be at the 12th fret, so you've always got a fast reference. I don't know how accurate this is, but it's handy just to check that you're in the right sort of ballpark for what you're aiming for. These things are great for when you're working on frets and don't want to damage your fretboard. Nice and flexible. You can hold them on with a bit of elastic band or tape and just keep moving it as you work along. I've got a few of these, so I tend to just put a few on at a time and then just work through a little bit faster. Cloth tape and aluminium tape. Cloth tape's great for insulating, aluminium tape's great for conductivity, so use that for shielding, use that to stop shorting. Allen keys. Every time you buy a guitar it comes with at least one Allen key. My wife hates the fact that everywhere she looks there's an Allen key in the house, but I find it really useful for what I do. Strings, may seem obvious, but always have a good selection. I've got a range from the sort of things that I usually use, and my favourites have always been D'Addario's 10 to 46s. It's a gauge I found early on, and it's a gauge I stuck with. It just feels comfortable to me. I've also got a few 9s, got an 11, and 1052s just for a little bit of a heavier feel in the low end. I tend to use the D'Addario's for when guitars are finished. The cheaper brands of strings, I would say use them while you're setting up if you're trying to sort of level out, you know, sort of the angle of your strings and everything, or even if it's just sort of a throw it together just to see if it works before you paint it or do any more work to it. The downside to guitar strings is once they're on, if you take them off, they probably won't go back on again without snapping. On to cleaning products. I'll always use lemon oil for nourishing the wood on the fretboard. It's generally quite good for lifting the grease out of the wood, and it also gives it a nice richer look once it's been done. A lot of cheap guitars come with very dry fretboards, so always something worth having in the toolbox. Gibson pump polish. It doesn't necessarily have to be Gibson. Dunlop do a good range of stuff. This just happened to be what I bought at the time because it was a bigger bottle. And it's lasted me about 10 years now. It's probably still about half of it left, so really good for getting sticky residues off, cleaning fingerprints, cleaning chrome work, and generally just cleaning. And then fast fret, something that I've always used since I was a kid when I started out on bass. So you've got this little stick with a fibrous buffer pad. It's preloaded, and you just run it along your strings and then wipe off with the provided cloth. And the reason for that is that it provides like an oil lubrication, so not only does it make your strings feel and play faster, but it also stops them from tarnishing as quickly. This has always been a recommendation of mine. And you can't talk about cleaning without rags. So I've got my polishing rag, which is a little bit abrasive, so quite good for getting in with the polish and making sure that you're getting off all the crap. And a separate one always for the lemon oil. This one's a bit softer. It doesn't really have to be softer, it's just that's what I had lying around at the time. It's an old work shirt. These crappy cables and plectrums that come with every new cheap guitar, just keep them in the toolbox. Always handy for quickly checking through an amp that you've got your electric spot on, and also if you're tuning with the little plug-in tuners rather than the clip-on tuners. This is a flux pen, which is probably better used for working with PCBs and things like that, but I do scribble this onto the back of a pot before I solder it, just because it means the solder adheres quicker to the pot rather than heating it up for too long, which can damage it. So this is both a time saver and a money saver. Always keep a selection of strap buttons and strap locks in your toolbox. My favourites have always been these Marvel style ones, which you can get for about £2 each. They're really good because you just pop that off, stick your strap onto that, put that over the top, and then tighten it up. And then that's it, that's your strap on there forever. If you want to remove the strap, just pull up this collar and it pops right off. But it's not going anywhere without you pulling that. Sometimes if you're working on pedals and doing weird things with electric guitars, it's always worth stocking up on just little oddities that you find. Always have little locking switches for pedals, just because it's something handy to have around. This is probably a bad example of a countersink, because this is made for wood, but it's useful enough for getting through scratch plates and just making sure that the screws sit nice and flush. Small files are always handy. Sometimes, especially with really cheap guitars, you do get a bit of rough edging going on with either the frets or any of the hardware. So something just to take the edge off, make it a little bit more comfortable to play. Now these are kind of useful. They're retractable brushes. Got one for fibre. It's kind of soft but also kind of stiff, so it's good for getting into smaller, hard to reach areas to clean them out. And the steel one's quite good for roughing up the back of pots and things like that, or good for cleaning off rust from screw heads as well. Tiny tape measure. Doesn't go particularly long, but it'll get you scale length easy enough, and it's also easier than carrying a ruler around. And then we've got this thing, which is just a general multi-tool, but good for grabbing things, good for hitting things when you need to. A string grinder with a bridge pin puller. And somewhere to hide your weed. Thanks, Dunlop. And that's about it. So it took me a while to build up the toolbox that I've got. There's probably things I'd add to it, there's probably things I'd take away that I don't tend to use very much. Mostly it just gets full of parts that I've taken off things temporarily, and then they don't go back on because I wait ages in between actually completing projects a lot of the time. So leave a comment below, let me know if there's anything that you think is important that I've missed out. Let me know if there's anything I've got that you've never considered before. As a guitar community, I think we should share our experience and also just generally help each other out. Nobody's in competition with each other unless you work for Gibson. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.